Govinder, can you also start the recording?
Yes. Oh,
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. We are from ISPRS Student Consortium, and we welcome all of you for today's webinar on unmanned aerial system and LiDAR sensing modalities for smart agriculture. Guidelines for the presentation. Please introduce yourself in the chat box and where you are attending from. And there is a question and answer session after the lecture. Use the Q&A window to ask questions to the lecture. Keep your questions to the topic related, and if the speaker would like to interact with you, kindly raise your hand for any queries. We are the official representation of youth to the ISPRS, and we provide a link to students, young researchers, and professionals worldwide. We also publish multiple newsletters throughout the year. Till now, we have published 15 newsletters, and recently we have published one latest edition on application of close range remote sensing for forestry application. And we also have an upcoming newsletter issue on use of social media data in geospatial analysis. We also conduct regular webinars on different topics which would help all our community. We also have a YouTube channel in which we present all the recordings of the sessions and the webinars that we organize. We also have a wide footprint on the multiple social media platforms, so you can always connect to us. And we would also here present that we are organizing a summer school in Taiwan, which is happening in November 3rd to 8th, 23. So you can still have chance to register for the summer school. And we are also looking for proofreading team for our student consortium and also a design team. So if you guys are interested, try to catch the opportunity. And regarding today's session, we have an distinguished lecturer from Purdue University, Dr. Ayman Habib. He is professor and co-director of Civil Engineering Center for Applications of UAS for Sustainable Environment. He is also the associate director of Purdue University Joint Transportation Research Program. Dr. Habib's interest spans in the field of terrestrial and aerial mobile mapping. Thank you very much and looking forward to your active participants. Over to you, Professor.
thank you. So I can share my screen. Okay. So hopefully you can see my screen now.
Yes, Professor.
Okay.
You can go ahead.
Okay, let me see. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining today for this talk, where I will be talking about the use of unmanned aerial systems equipped with imaging and LiDAR modalities for smart agriculture. And I will be mainly focusing on high throughput phenotyping. So let me just have my laser pointer on. So we have a great demand for increasing crop yield. And just to give you an idea about how much we need to do the improvement of our yield of crops, is that comparing to 2005, we have to increase or double the global crop yield by 2050 to meet the global demand for food. And one, or like the best way to do this or meet this need is through smart agriculture. So in smart agriculture, it's basically concerned with management practices to ensure that fertilizers, herbicides, seed, fuel, or irrigation, all these requirements are basically applied at the right place and at the right time. And remote sensing systems on different platforms, whether it's spaceborne, airborne, or wheel-based platforms, play a key role in smart, or if you would like to call it digital agriculture in general, or what's also known as precision agriculture. So to meet the increased demand for crop yield, the genetic improvements of the seeds, this is really the best way to meet this demand. And this is done through what's known as seed breeding trials. So what you see here on the lower left corner is a seed breeding trial. So where you can see actually each one of these blocks, actually they're called plots. And the plots, they have some row segments, and you have alleys in between the different plots. So what is really happening in this seed breeding trial is that they do gene manipulation of the seeds, and then every set of seeds with specific gene constitution, they are planted in one of these small plots. And based on the reaction of the genetic constitution of the seeds and the crop yield, they basically detect the best genetic seed variety for having a larger crop yield or larger biomass. So what's really is happening here is that they do what they call genotype-phenotype correlation. So what is really genotype-phenotype correlation is that genotype, that's the genetic constitution of the seed. And the phenotype, that's basically the appearance or basically the reaction of the plant to environmental condition. And this is basically what allows us to determine the crop yield or the biomass from a certain crop. So gene sequencing is affordable and quick. So right now it's quite practical and not really that difficult to have thousands and thousands of genetic manipulation of a given seed. And the problem is correlating the genotype and the phenotype. So basically you have a seed with certain genetic characteristics, how these actually genetic characteristics affect the shape, the biomass of the plant. This is what they call correlating genotype, phenotype of the seeds. And this is very important because by doing this proper correlation, we can increase the crop yield under these, I would say, constraints like a reduced agricultural land. We would like to have more biomass for biofuel generation, modifying the plant structure so basically can grow the plants at higher density, as well as increasing the plant resistance to drought, disease, pests, and reduce the requirements for fertilizers. So the traditional way of doing this phenotyping, either you do it in a greenhouse or you do it in the field in a limited scale. So that's not really beneficial to do this only very small samples of the fields or the plots. In addition to that, it's very time consuming and labor intensive because of the way that you have humans involved, they record data, it's error prone. And in some cases, the best way to do the phenotyping is that you have to uproot the plant and do this destructive sampling and measurements of the plant. So the field phenotyping at a larger scale or large area coverage, that's really the bottleneck for increasing crop yield using this genetic sequences manipulation. So this is where basically our work comes in, is that how we can use remote sensing systems to do what is known as high throughput phenotyping. So by high throughput phenotyping is that basically you do phenotyping of large seed breeding trials. So in this talk, I will be mainly talking about using GNSS, INS assisted imaging and LiDAR systems on board unmanned aerial vehicles for having better georeferenced imagery and LiDAR data to aid the process of producing point cloud, for example, structure for motion and ortho photo generation, which are mainly targeted in like about the agricultural fields. But before doing that, I would like just to spend some time talking about some basics for object space reconstruction, point positioning equations, error sources, and their mitigation. I'm sure all of you have lots of expertise in this area, but this is very important to put these things in perspective. So first, let's start talking about the sensing modalities that I'm going to focus on. So the first type is what we call frame cameras. So these are most RGB cameras we have are frame cameras. So basically with a single exposure, you cover two-dimensional area on the ground, and all the pixels here within this 2D frame, they have one set of exterior orientation parameters, which is basically 3 parameters for position and 3 parameters for rotation. The other type of cameras is what we call line cameras. So line cameras are usually used for cameras where we have lots of bands, for example, hyperspectral imagery. So in this case, rather than capturing the data on a frame by frame basis, you capture it on a line by line basis. And that's why they are called line camera. So you have these line camera exposures, and then you aggregate all these exposures, and you have a scene that covers an area on the ground. So in a way, each one of these lines has its own perspective center, and it has its own exterior orientation parameter. And because of the way we do the collection, that you have the system is moving as you scanning or collecting data in these different lines, if you have any turbulence or the trajectory is not really straight, you will have these wavy patterns in the captured imagery. So theoretically, these plants are grown in a straight line, but because of the turbulence in the trajectory, you see this wavy pattern. And then the last sensing modality that I'm focusing on is what we call LiDAR. So LiDAR, basically, you have a pulse, and then you estimate the coordinates of the footprint of the pulse. So in a way, you can think about this, that for every laser beam, you have its own position and orientation parameter. So you have a single exterior orientation parameter for every laser pulse. So these are the systems that I'll be talking about. So what are the products we are interested in? So we are interested in point clouds. So this is just an example of point cloud derived from LiDAR over a seed breeding trial. We can also derive point clouds from imagery using structure for motion. We would like also to have ortho photos, whether it's based on RGB data or hyperspectral data. So these are the desired products. One important aspect of these desired product that we would like to make sure that they are well georeferenced. So basically, each one of these plots, we would like to be able to track it through time within the growing season. So basically, we say this is the behavior of this particular genetic constitution of the seed in a given plot throughout the time. And even within the plot, because of the way that they are very small, like we don't like the what they call them boundary rows. So let me go back here. So in this case, when we do this manipulation, we would like to ignore the data we have on these row boundaries or the boundaries of the plot, because this is not really the normal condition of the row segments in the actual planting. You have the seeds, or more or less the plants, inside a group. So we only would like to focus on the internal part of the plot. So what I'm trying to say here, that when you have this georeference information, would like to make sure that this georeference information is quite good to the individual plant level. So we are targeting very high level of positional accuracy. We can really say it's almost in the inch level. And you would like to make sure that the data you get, whether it's from the RGB camera, whether it's from the hyperspectral camera. So here we have examples where we have a shortwave infrared camera and visible near infrared camera. Both of these are hyperspectral line cameras. And we have LiDAR. We want to make sure that these data sets are properly aligned or georeferenced at the inch level. So here, this is the entire field, and I'm showing here portions of the field from different sensing modalities. So when we look at the principles of 3D reconstruction from remote sensing data. So for example, what if we have imagery and LiDAR? The two main components you need to have is what we call the sensor interior orientation parameters or internal characteristics. So what really is the interior orientation parameters? So if you have a camera with an image, basically you have the perspective center, which is somewhere within the lens of the camera, and you have the image points. And with the interior orientation parameters, we are trying to define the light ray from the camera perspective center to every point in the image frame in the sensor frame coordinate system. So we have here, we have the camera coordinate system, and by the interior orientation parameter, we define each one of these light rays in the camera frame. The same thing for LiDAR. You have actually individual laser beams, and by doing the interior orientation parameters, we define the orientation of each one of those beams in the LiDAR unit coordinate systems, as well as any errors or systematic errors in the ranges. We have to consider them also as part of the interior orientation parameter. The next step for the reconstruction is to define the sensor frame, whether it's a LiDAR or a camera, in a mapping frame. So that's what we call georeferencing or exterior orientation parameters. So here, that's what we have here. We say R, the lowercase r, stands for the position of the sensor relative to the mapping frame at time t. And this uppercase R, that represents the rotation of the sensor frame relative to the mapping frame at time t. And here time is very important because as the LiDAR moves or as the camera moves, basically we have a different position and orientation for every time. So one common way of defining the position and orientation of the sensor frame relative to the mapping frame is having an integrated GNSS-INS unit, or basically global navigation satellite system combined with inertial navigation system. And by doing this GPS-INS data acquisition and the integration, you can position the body frame of and orient the body frame of your GPS-INS unit relative to the mapping frame. And if you have a rigid relationship between your sensor and your body frame, you can basically estimate this invariant lever arm and the bore side, or spatial offset and the rotational offset between your sensor frame and the body frame. And by combining this lever arm and the bore side with the GPS-INS position and orientation, you can derive the exterior orientation parameters of the sensor, whether it's the camera or a LiDAR unit. So now, if you have the interior orientation parameters and the exterior orientation parameters, you can develop these point positioning equations, which are very simple. So for example, we said here that you have the GNSS-INS integration with its own body frame coordinate system. After doing that, you get the position of the body frame and the orientation of the body frame relative to the mapping frame at any time t. And most of the GPS-INS units right now, they can give you this position and the orientation somewhere between 100 hertz or 200 hertz. And then you have the different sensors, whether it's the camera, whether it's a LiDAR, RGB frame camera, or hyperspectral line camera. You have the lever arm and the bore side for each one of these units, and then you have a laser beam, or you have a light ray for each one of the cameras. So In the point position equation is very simple. If we would like to say what is the coordinates of this point relative to the mapping frame, so this vector is just the summation of these three vectors, and that's what we have here in those equations. So this is the vector that describe the position of the body frame relative to the mapping frame. That's the first one. The second one is the lever arm between my sensor. In this case, it happens to be the laser unit relative to the body frame. And the third vector here, that's the position of this point here relative to the laser unit. So you have these three vectors. They are in different coordinate systems. So you have to make sure that you pre-multiply these vectors with the proper rotation matrix to have them in the mapping frame. So the LiDAR point positioning equation is very simple, just a simple vector summation process. It's exactly the same for frame camera and line camera. The only difference that in a camera, we only have the vector from the perspective center to the image point. As a result, we have to have this scaling factor that basically extends this vector from the perspective center all the way to the object point. And this is the same thing for line camera. There is no difference. So what's really the objective is that you have these cameras and you have the LiDAR at different locations from on board the UEV, and then you have the associated GPS INS unit, and you would like to do a 3D reconstruction from all these sensors, and you have the full object space. As I mentioned, the most important thing that these derived products should be well georeferenced, because again, as I mentioned, for phenotyping, we would like to track individual area on the ground for a particular genetic constitution of the seed throughout the growing season, and that's what allows us how this different genetic constitution of this seed reacts to different environmental conditions, whether it's temperature, humidity, like irrigation or water availability, pests, and so forth. So just to remind you again, for LiDAR, because it's an active sensor, a single pulse will give you the coordinates of its footprint. However, in an imagery, because it just basically we don't have the scale, we need to have a minimum of 2 light rays to intersect to define the object point. So unfortunately, whatever we measure from our GPS INS or from our cameras or from our LiDAR, we have random and systematic errors. So our measurements are corrupted by random errors and systematic errors. So just to give you an example, if you have LiDAR measurements and these 3 points are theoretically belong to a flat surface, if you take them, you can see that they are not really on a planar surface. Why? Again, either because of random errors or systematic errors. The same situation will happen if you have imagery. So for example, if you have the same point tracked in 3 images, from images 1 and 3, that will be the object point. From image 1 and 2, that will be the object point. And if you take actual images 2 and 3, you will get a third object point. So you can really see here that the light rays from the 3 images, which correspond to the same point, they do not represent a single point in the object space. So as a result, we have to have a procedure that allows us to reduce the impact of these random and systematic errors to give us the best reconstruction possible. And this is done through a triangulation procedure. So a triangulation procedure is an adjustment engine that takes redundant measurements that with random and systematic errors and tries to estimate the systematic errors and reduce the impact of the random errors to give you the best object space possible. So for example, here you can see here, these are the camera. And as we said, because of the random and systematic errors, you have different object space points. And again, if you have LiDAR data, again, because of random and systematic errors, you get different features that should represent a single planar surface. In the triangulation, we would like to integrate all these measurements, and we have a single adjustment that gives me basically a single point from the 3 imaging rays here and a single planar surface from the LiDAR. That's basically what we are trying to do in the triangulation. And what we do in the triangulation, or what of the byproducts, you get an improved interior and exterior orientation parameters, and those are the necessary products for, or the necessary intermediate products for the final products, whether they are orthophotos or point clouds. So this is really the bulk of the talk, is that what does it take to use remote sensing modalities like imagery, LiDAR, to satisfy the requirements of this high throughput phenotype. So I am showing here these 5 components. They are interconnected. They are not really independent from each other. So just one of them is basically the sensors and the platforms you will be using to collect the data. So we have a lot of sensors. We can have spaceborne, airborne, or ground sensor. In this talk, I'm mainly focusing on the UAV, and I'm focusing on LiDAR, RGB, hyperspectral cameras assisted by GNSS INS. That's the sensor platforms. Again, how you do the system calibration, we'll talk about that. How you do the 3D reconstruction, how you do higher level data processing, and how you visualize your products. These are all components of a fully integrated remote sensing system targeted at high throughput phenotype. So let's start talking about the sensors and the platforms. So as I mentioned throughout the first part of the talk, the platform are unmanned aerial vehicles or uncrewed aerial vehicles. The sensors, we have georeferencing units like integrated GNSS INS units. We have RGB cameras, we have thermal cameras, we have hyperspectral cameras that could be in the visible or near infrared, and we have LiDAR sensors as well. So we have a wide range of sensors that can be mounted on a UAV. So this is just an example. This is a UAV equipped with a hyperspectral sensor in the near infrared, visible and near infrared, and this is a hyperspectral sensor on a shortwave infrared. And this is just a closer look of different systems where we have a LiDAR, we have the GPS INS card is inside this enclosure here. This is the hyperspectral camera in the visible and near infrared. This is the RGB camera. This is looking closer inside this enclosure here. So this is the GPS, and you can see here, this is the IMU body frame, or the body frame of the GPS INS unit. This is another type, like we have lots of technology developments. We have new UAVs, we have newer LiDAR units available. So right now, as a user community, we have access to a wide range of sensors we can use on board the UAVs. So now I'll talk about the geometric system calibration, because this is really the most important part. So why do we care about geometric system calibration? And again, I'm focusing here on high throughput phenotype. So as we said, we have a seed breeding trial. We have a row segment which has seeds with specific genetic constitution, and we would like to track the individual row segment throughout the growing season. So I'm showing here an example from June 16 all the way to August 16. And in some cases, we are even interested in tracking individual plants. So here we have a flowering process where we have some panicles starting, and we would like to track these flowers or the panicles throughout this period from July 25th to August 16th. So we have very strict requirements in terms of the positional quality of my product. And here we are talking about something from image. The same thing happens if you are talking about LiDAR. So here I'm showing the same field with the same seed breeding trials, but now in June 10th, June 17th, and August 4th. So I'm showing this particular profile here, which is it's exactly at the same location. So you can see here in June 10, that's very early in the season. The seeds are just planted. So the LiDAR data for this profile gives us the ground surface. And then We have the second profile is in June 17. So you can see these are the individual plants are starting to emerge. And then we look at the same profile, but now in August 4, and you can see here the individual rows here or individual plants. And then even in this case, we have a Geiger mode LiDAR. So Geiger mode LiDAR, that's LiDAR captured by crewed aerial vehicles flying at 12,000 feet or almost between 3.5 to 4 kilometers above the ground level. So these are the point clouds from the Geiger mode. So this data sets collected at different times in June 10, June 17, August 4th, and this case is September 3rd, would like to make sure that those the point clouds are well georeferenced so you can track the individual object, in this case, individual plant or row segment throughout the growing season. So hopefully it's becoming quite clear why we care too much about the geolocation accuracy. Another thing which is very important here, one can say, okay, if I have control points, and basically I will use the control points in my georeferencing, this problem can be done very precisely. However, we are talking here about large trials where establishing control points is not feasible. So we cannot really say that this problem will be solved through ground control points. That's practically very expensive and it's not really scalable. So we would like to do that without using any control in the experiment by establishing ground control. So in order to do that, we have to worry about the calibration. We have to really make sure that the interior characteristics of the sensors are properly modeled and compensated for the relationship between the different sensors, the LiDAR, the camera, and the GPS INS, the lever arm and the bore sight. We have to make sure that they are properly estimated. When you do the data logging, if there is some time synchronization shifts or offsets between the different system or between the different time clocks, we have to estimate this as well. And the final thing, that you can determine the internal characteristics of the sensor at a given time, you need to make sure are these internal characteristics stable over time or not. So that's what we call here stability analysis. So we have to really do the calibration to ensure that all these aspects are taken care of to get good products from the different systems. And what I mean by good products, they are well aligned. So just to give you an idea about the conceptual basis of the adjustment process. So let's say that you have a LiDAR, one flight line, you get a point cloud. You have another flight line, you get another point cloud. You have an imagery data, and you get a third point cloud. And then if you want put these point clouds together, if there are some problems, either in the georeferencing or the system calibration, these 3D products will not align well. So you will observe discrepancies between these point clouds. So what we do actually is that in our system calibration procedure, we introduce a target function that we say that we would like to minimize the squared normal distance of the discrepancies between these different products. That's why we call it least squares adjustment. And in some cases, if it happens that we have control data, we'd like to make sure also we minimize the reconstruction from these different modalities and the control data. So that's simply what the system calibration is doing. So here we have actually a platform, we call it a universal multi-sensor aerial triangulation that can incorporate data from RGB frame cameras, hyperspectral line cameras, LiDAR system. It can incorporate information from the GPS INS, and depending on the type of the features you can use, we can either use points, lines, or planar features. And I will show you an example of using a linear feature in the next few slides. And all this stuff is fed into this multi-primitive, multimodal optimization engine. By multi-primitive, I mean it can handle points, lines, or aerial features. Multimodal, it can handle RGB, hyperspectral, or LiDAR. And then it does the adjustment to give you the system calibration parameters, feature parameters, and in some cases, we have to refine even the GPS INS trajectory. So now I will move to the the third block, which is the georeferencing and the 3D reconstruction that handles some of these objectives. So let's start first with imagery. We usually, if we have overlapping imagery, we have a well-established procedure for generating point clouds from imagery or doing the triangulation using what's called structure from motion. We have commercial packages for structure from motion, and even we have open source packages for structure from motion. And if you think about structure from motion, it's a relatively simple process. You have imagery, you have some information about the internal characteristics of the camera. We do actually feature detection. So you apply some interest operators, for example, SIFT, which is scale invariant feature transform. You derive key points or interest points. You have descriptors for these key points. That's what we call here by this characterization. Using the descriptors of these features, you can do feature matching. The way we usually do that, we do them on an image pair basis. And then you identify the same features throughout all your images within the block. And then you try to recover initial parameters for the exterior orientation parameters of the camera, as well as the 3D coordinates of the object points. You feed all this stuff into a bundle adjustment engine to do least squares adjustment, and then you get the refined internal and exterior orientation parameters, as well as the sparse point cloud that corresponds to the feature you extracted and match it. And if you have GPS INS information, you can feed them as prior information to the bundle adjustment. So the structure for motion as a concept is a very simple concept. So for the feature detection, so basically you apply, for example, SIFT operator on the left image and the right image. These are examples of detected features. And using the descriptors, you can match them. So for example, you say this feature here, what is the closest descriptor or the closest feature with the corresponding descriptor to this one? And based on that, we decide what is the matching point. So usually you do this exhaustive matching. You try this feature with all the features in the right image to determine the corresponding feature. And here I'm showing an example. You have a left image and a right image in an urban area. So you have well-defined features, building corners, parking lots, lane markings, and so forth. So you can see here the matches between the left image and the right image are quite consistent. So these yellow lines actually start with a feature in the left image and ends with what the descriptor match believes to be the corresponding feature in the right image. So you can see here that we have very good matches. Unfortunately, if we do that in a seed breeding trial, even if we have plants with different genetic constitution for the seed, they still look similar. So in this case, when you see the matches between the left image and the right image, you can see that we have lots of outliers or false matching. So this will make the structure from motion fails. And what we have done in this area is that rather than doing this feature matching based on an exhaustive matching, we can really say that we have some prior information from the GPS INS unit. We can really say that for this feature, there is a high likelihood that the matching will be in a much smaller area than the entire image. So what we did here is just a very simple modification by considering the georeferencing parameters to identify the location where most probably we have the corresponding feature. This actually improves the quality of the match much, much better. So you can see here we have much cleaner matches between features in the left image and features in the right image, even if we have lots of repetitive patterns because of this, the mechanized way of doing the agriculture. The last actual modification is what we call GNSS INS assisted structure from motion. So you remember, as part of the structure from motion, you have to track the matches throughout the entire images, and then you have to try to do outlier removal, because whether we like it or not, there will always be outliers in our matching. So one thing is actually here, if you consider the georeferencing information in this incremental exterior orientation parameter recovery and the 3D point cloud generation, you can do some sort of similar, like a ransack-based strategy to identify outliers and remove them. And that will increase the reliability and the performance of the structure from motion. So just to give you an example, so we have the same seed breeding trial here, and we did different structure from motion. This is a traditional structure from motion. These are our implementation, is what we call partially GNSS-INS assisted, where we use them only in the image space matching, the GPS-INS, and then the fully GNSS-INS assisted, where we use the GPS-INS both in the image matching and the incremental OP recovery. And then we have the PIX4D. So PIX4D actually, which is a very well-known or a well-known structure from motion. We have this PIX4D, the default, and PIX4D aided by GPS information as well. And then here I'm showing the LiDAR data as a reference. So these are the point clouds here. And then what you see on the right here is the number of points we reconstructed. So you can see here, PIX4D, whether it's the standard approach or using the GNSS, we're getting more than 1 million points in this particular area. We can see the traditional SFM is giving me only 120,000. With the partially or fully GNSS INS assisted, we have 270 to 300, so almost 250,000 points. So on a first glance, we can really say, oh, the PIX4D is doing much better. And in the sense of the number of points, definitely is doing much better. But if you look actually, where are the majority of these million points or million plus points we get from PIX4D? They are at the perimeter of the field. And the perimeter of the field, why? Because this is the area where we have these grass strips and we have more unique like signal, and PIX4D is doing much better job in those areas. But from a seed breeding trial, we don't really care too much about this, like the perimeter of the experiment. We are more interested in the center of the experiment. So you can see here, we have very few points in the center of the experiment. However, with the partially GNSS-INS assisted or the fully GNSS-INS assisted, we get coverage inside the experiment, and that's really the most important part. So this is one thing here. We cannot really just look into the number of reconstructed points as the criteria for evaluating the quality of the reconstruction. So again, if you look at the orthophoto again, if you see use the traditional GPS-INS assisted, we have some gaps. If with the actually PIX4D, you have some gaps. By the fully GNSS-INS assisted, you have a full coverage of the fields, which basically that's what we are looking for. So this is basically what we have done before. But if you look at these, all these are based on point features or basically key features which are derived, for example, by SIFT. But I'll give you some examples. In some cases for seed breeding trials, we have to fly very low or very close to the plants because we'd like to get very high resolution. So just to give you an example, in some of the seed breeding trial objectives, they are interested in knowing when, like the tassels here for maize or corn, or some of the panicles start to appear, because knowing when the plants start to flower or have these panicles or tassels, you can use data analytics to know or predict the biomass by the end of the experiments. And that's very important for food security, knowing in the middle of the growing season to precisely predict the biomass. That's very important. So if you look at these actually cases where you have to fly very low and very close to the plants, and this is an example here, this is two overlapping images, you can see because of some wind conditions, you can see in one of the images, you have the row segments are straight, but because of some of the wind, the same row segment in another flight or another image, it's wavy. because of just the wind. So here, actually trying to match the same feature in the left or right images or the block of overlapping images becomes quite critical. So we cannot rely on the traditional point features to do the structure from motion. How can we solve this problem? Is basically, rather than working on individual points, we can really say we can use the row segments as my linear features, and in this case, that becomes my parameter. So this is a valid assumption in seed breeding trials because you have planters or tractors that do the seeding with auto steer functions. And even if we do this manually, they are well planted that basically the row segments can be assumed to be straight line. But the question here that arises that how can we automatically or semi-automatically extract these individual row segments and match them in the overlapping images? That becomes now the bottleneck. So remember, in structure from motion, we extract the points and then we match them and we track them throughout the images. Now we would like to do the same thing, but rather than doing this with points, we will do this with lines, and these lines represent the row segments. So that's the problem. So we developed a procedure actually, and I will go through this quickly, that basically we try to automatically extract the linear features or the row segments from the LiDAR data. I'll talk about this in the next few minutes. And we can try to semi-automatically extract the row segments from the overlapping image. So let's first start with assuming that I extracted the linear features from the LiDAR data. So I'll talk about this in the next few minutes. So if you have actually the individual row segments extracted from the LiDAR data, and you have some like you have a good GPS INS and a good, or I would say reasonable system calibration, you can take each one of these row segments and you predict where it's going to be in the image. But again, you have some problems in the trajectory or the system calibration. So this prediction will not be precise, but it will be close enough. So this is just an example here. This is the row segments from the LiDAR data. When you back project it into the imagery, you can see it's close to the row segments in the image, but it's not really on top of the center line of the row segments in the image. So what we would like to do actually, how can we do this precise refinement of this projection? So we do this right now, I would say manually. So basically you can do this back projection, and then you can do manually actually fine tune these row segments until you match them in the image. And actually what we can do, and this is very nice, like for example, in some of these GIS tools like QGIS, you don't need to do it only on a row segment by row segment. You say that I have these 3 row segments, basically they show the same discrepancy, so you can move them as one basically entity into the right location. So it's not done on a line segment by line segment or row segment by row segment individually. Is done on a group basis at the same time. And then we have a mathematical model, something similar to the basically for the collinearity equations, that says actually that the linear feature in the object space, the linear feature in the image space, and the perspective center are coplanar. So just because of that time, I'm not really going through the details, but we have different ways of doing that. We have what we call image-based coplanarity, where basically you enforce the coplanarity constraint on these vectors from the perspective center to the first endpoint, the perspective center to the second endpoint, and the perspective center to the image line. So by saying all these actually should be coplanar, that's the constraint we use in our target function. And you can see that this constraint incorporates or involves the exterior orientation parameters, the lever arm and the board side, the trajectory, and the object space parameters. So by using them in the adjustment, you can refine all these parameters together. What we have noticed actually, because this is coplanarity is based on the image space, it's become sensitive to the noise in the image measure. So However, if you do this through what we call object space coplanarity, so you do the coplanarity in the object space by considering the vector from the perspective center to the first object point along the line, the second object point along the line, and any point along the image space. So you have this constraint here. In this case, it involves or it includes the same parameters, but it's less sensitive to the image measurement noise. So if you look at this, this is the orthophoto from the without doing this row segment based triangulation. You can see actually the first thing is that the projection of the LiDAR is not aligned with the image linear feature. That's the same thing here. You see, this is a projection of the LiDAR row segment. This is where the row segment should be in the image. The other thing, actually, you can see misalignment within the orthophotos. Like when we do a transition from one image to another, you can see some misalignment. However, after we do this line-based or row segment-based triangulation, we have good alignment between the LiDAR and the image orthophotos and good alignment within the orthophoto. So that tells us actually here also that in some applications, you might have very, very strict requirements. You have some actually conditions that will not allow you to do the traditional points-based structure for motion. So now I have the last two things here, and maybe I should ask the coordinator, how much time do I have?
You can take 10 to 15 minutes, Professor.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll talk about the data processing. Sorry, was there something else? So I'll try to be done in 10 minutes. So let's first part, we'll talk about the automated extraction of the linear features from the LiDAR data. So just to remind you again, these are the seed breeding trials. This is a plot, that's a row segment, and then the gaps in between these plots, that's what we call alleys. So now we would like to see how can we automatically extract the rows and alleys from the LiDAR data. And that's what we needed, for example, for the line-based triangulation in the previous discussion. So we need, the automated extraction of the rows and alleys are very important for plot extraction because we would like to automatically extract the individual plots from our data. Structure for motion from large-scale imagery, that's what we just talked about. Improving the orthophoto rectification, the quality control, because if you track the rows and alleys at different dates and you see are they aligned on top of each other or not, that's an indication of the alignment. And also deriving some feature-based characteristics for learning-based data analytics. So, this is, if you look into the LiDAR data, here I have a point density map, which is points per square meter, and this is the elevation. So if you look at this, you can see that wherever we have higher elevation, that's most probably where I have my plants. Wherever I have higher point density, that's also where we have plants. Because again, if you have a plant and we have the LiDAR, you have lots of points distributed along the plant from the ground all the way to the top. So higher point density and higher elevation corresponds to an existence of a plant. So one of the metrics, actually, if we really say, if you define a grid, and then you say the number of points in each cell or the elevation of the points in this cell, these are characteristics that tell you that there is a plant here. Even better, rather than doing the number of points only or the elevation only, if you do the sum of the elevations in the cell, that tells you actually gives you much more reliable information about the presence of the plant. So you define these, you have actually this LiDAR data, you define these cells. In each one of the cell, you do the sum of the elevations, and then you do a column sum. So by doing this column sum here, you have this pattern here. And because actually, whenever you have a large column sum, that's an indication of the plant. So you see that we have these individual peaks, and each one of those individual peaks gives me a certain row. So very nicely or very easily, actually without too major effort, we can identify the individual rows. If you do the row sum, But now, rather than looking at the individual peaks, we can look at these valleys. So those valleys correspond to the alleys between the experiment. So by doing this, actually, we can automatically detect the rows and the alleys, and that will give me the individual row segments. So this is just, for example, a seed breeding trial, and I'm focusing here on two regions of interest. One, where we basically will look into this column sum, and ROI2, or region of interest 2, where we'll do row sum. And this is basically what we have for the column sum for region of interest, but using different metrics, the number of points, some of the elevations, this one here, and this is the 90th percentile of the elevation. So this is really the best one because the sum of elevation reflects both the number of points and the elevation. And if you look closely here, you can see that we can nicely identify the peaks. That's one thing. And then if you can really see here how well the peaks are aligned on top of each other throughout different dates. So we see here in July, in August, and in September. So when we see alignment of those peaks in different dates, that tells me that my LiDAR point cloud is well reconstructed and well georeferenced because we can really see the rows are not moving from one date to another. So that's what I meant by the quality control. And if you look actually in this particular area here, you can see that we have rows which are well defined in July, but somehow we don't have corresponding peaks in August and September. And what this is happening, it's happening in this case actually. So in this case, between July and August and September, they did what they call destructive sampling. So they had a harvester and they removed all these two rows and they used them for some sort of destructive phenotype. So you can see actually which rows have been removed by looking at these peaks. The same thing here, we are looking at the valleys, sorry, the alleys. So as we said, the alleys will be the valleys in this row sum. So you can see actually here, if you look in this in early season, because we are looking for some point clouds that give us an idea about the indication of the plant. So the shorter the plant, that it will become a little bit challenging to identify the alleys. You can see here the alleys in this case are not really well defined. As much as they are well defined in August and September, we have more growth into the plant. But this is one can say something here actually. Early stage in the growth, the alleys can be detected very easily from the imagery because you have gaps between the experiments. However, later in the season, it will be harder to detect the alleys because you have this canopy closure, the plants are getting close to each other, and you will not see the alleys in the image. So by doing this, you can extract the rows and alleys very nicely from the LiDAR data. You see whether they are well aligned at the orthophoto. So that's again gives us an indication about the quality of the georeference. Now, the last part, which is the visualization, and I will do this very quickly. So one way of doing the visualization is by fusing the image and the LiDAR data is using orthophoto generation. So orthophoto generation is a very simple process. You have an orthophoto plane, you derive the elevations at the orthophoto cells, you do back projection into the imagery, you pick the gray values or color, and then you project them back into the image, into the orthophoto plane. That's your orthophoto. It's a very simple process. However, if you look into this, this is my image, original image, and this is the generated orthophoto. And if you look at this, the orthophoto looks very strange. And why is this the case? For several reasons. The surface model is not precise enough. What do I mean by precise enough? Is not actually dense enough to model every leaf and every feature in the plant. So we will never have a surface model which is complete. You have occlusions and double mapping problems, and you have also some mosaicing process. So if you remember from the orthophoto, if you have your surface model is flat, does not include the plants, in this case, your orthophoto will look good. However, you will see the plants leaning on the ground. So you will have good visual quality, but poor positional quality. If you do actually the traditional ways using an orthophoto, if the plant is close to the center of the image, you will get a reasonable orthophoto. However, if the plant is at the periphery of the image, you will have what we call double mapping problem. So areas which are in the occlusion because of the relief displacement will replicate some of the gray values on the plant top. And that's the problem we have. And when you combine these actually images with double mapping problems, you have these seam lines, and those seam lines, you can see some problems with this double mapping problem. So you can see this leaf here is exactly the same leaf. Why? Because of this double mapping problem. So there are ways actually to solve this problem. I'm not really going through the detail because of the time. So we can actually refine the quality of the surface model by using the cloth simulation process. And what we are trying to do here is just by getting smooth DSM, because sometimes if you have actually non-smooth DSM, the quality of the orthophoto will affect. So the criteria we said here, we said, for example, in this case, we are interested to improve the positional and geolocation quality at the row segments, where basically this is where we have the panicles or the tassels, and that's what we like to do. And then we say we can sacrifice some geometric quality at the mid distance between the individual row segments. So we did this process here, and I will jump this just because of the time. And we actually identified that by using this actually smoothing of the DSM and making sure that the seam line does not cross a row segment, we can get the best quality orthophoto. So this is basically covers the visualization aspect. So in summary here, what I'm saying is that if you have this actually data and you do proper georeferencing, you can track individual row segments throughout the growing season. So that's what we are showing here. This is the plants in June 6th. Now we are moving to June 28th. Now we are moving to July 11th. So you can see each of these red rectangles, that's a row segment. Now we will be moving to July 25th, and you can see some flowering, and this is August 8th. You can see here they did destructive sampling in these two rows, and then this is in August 30th. So you can see here, actually, this is sorghum. So sorghum, if you cut it, actually, it will grow again. So I will just give you another maybe minute to see this video again. We have the individual red rectangles. These are the individual row segments, which we extracted from the LiDAR data, as I explained. They are superimposed on top of the orthophoto. We have these multi-temporal orthophotos at different times. They are all well georeferenced. So basically, for each one of these row segments, we can track the growth of the plants throughout the growing season. So hopefully that shows you actually the process or the importance of making sure that we take care of all these aspects, from choosing the sensor, the platform, doing the calibration, doing the data processing, and the visualization as well. Just I'll take 2 minutes. This is actually, you can do it for other things as well. So we are using almost the same system for actually forestry. So forestry, now we are moving a little bit. Now we are looking at plants. So the plants actually are well structured. There are single row segments, but now we can do them in a forestry, which is a little bit unorganized or not really organized the same way as plant. So this is actually, we have a framework which is quite similar to what we discussed for high throughput phenotyping. And this is actually some results where we have the LiDAR data in a forest plantation. So here, actually, this is a forest plantation of what they call high value trees. So they plant them in a grid pattern. And now this is actually, we have the data processing. We identify the individual trees. So in this point cloud, you have the point clouds color coded by the individual trees. And then this one gives you actually the individual trees color coded by height. because height is one of the important biometrics for forestry and for plants as well. And this is the visualization of the data based on the diameter at breast height. So what now really the conclusions that for UEV mapping in general, basically for a given application, you have to really say what is the data I'm collecting and what is my end product. So for example, when we produce an orthophoto for phenotyping, we have to really understand what is the end user requirements, and we have to really make sure that we have the proper sensor, the proper data processing to give us the information it's needed. And sometimes after having actually one iteration, we say we might need to fine tune the data acquisition system to better provide the requirements of the data use. I am coming from a geomatics point of view. Most of you are from this background. For us, actually, the quality assurance and the quality control of the mapping process to making sure that your product has the quality, the geometric quality, the spectral quality that you claim, that has to be an essential part of the data processing. You have to make sure that your products are as accurate as you claim it to be, as well as you have to provide metrics that give the user confidence that these products are accurate. So this is why I said that the applications, and for a given applications, you have to consider the georeferencing, the data analytics to do the product, and the standards or the guidelines, the best practices for the quality assurance and quality control are very important. So thank you very much for your patience and attention, and I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you, Professor. That was indeed a quite insight about the topic and the developments that you have been doing. Uh, Participants, if you have questions, you can type in the chat window. And we have a couple of questions here. Like the first question is, what are the advantages of the line camera, Professor?
Okay, so that's an important question. So the reason they have line camera, it's not an advantage as much as it's a constraint. So for example, when we talk about hyperspectral camera, so for a hyperspectral camera, they basically take the every pixel and if it's, for example, in the visible and near infrared portion of the spectrum. So this portion of the spectrum from wavelengths 0.4 micron to 0.7 or 0.8 micron, they divide this into 200 bands or 300 bands. So for every pixel, you have to read 200 bands or 300 bands. So because of the technology limitation, you cannot have a 2D camera with hyperspectral that in a, I would say less than or within actually a second or less than a second, you read 200 bands for every pixel in this camera. So rather than capturing the camera in a 2D frame, they do it one line by one line basis. So by doing this on a line by line basis, it's technology more feasible to have those 200 bands per pixel. Hopefully I answered the question.
Thank you, Professor. And there is one more question. Can you enlighten more on how the dense point cloud and orthomosaic in less texture difference objects like plants and crops were generated?
So, I mean, like we cannot really say that we have less texture. We still have texture. The problem we have is that we have uniform texture or repeated texture. So that was really the problem. So the point cloud generation, the problem is not the lack of lecture. It is mainly the presence of repeated texture. And this repeated texture would lead to either matching ambiguities or rejecting true matches. So what we did is that we used the GPS INS data and our mission planning activities and our initial or nominal system calibration parameters to basically reduce the possibility of ambiguities or outliers in the matching process. So hopefully that answered the question.
Yes, Professor. So we can wait for 1 minute. If anybody has some questions, they can please type in the chat window. Okay, then. If anybody has some questions, you can always write a mail to us or Professor Habib directly. Thank you, Professor. Thank you for joining us today.
You're more than welcome. Thank you very much.
Have a nice day.
You
Have a
too.
nice day, everyone.